We begin this morning with the late Peter Barry, former Foreign Minister, Taoiseach and Deputy Leader of Fine Gael, who died recently. Last week we heard of Peter Barry, tea merchant and tea taster. This morning, Peter Barry, politician.
My father was steeped in Fine Gael politics. My grandfather, I would suspect, would have been an Irish Parliamentary Party supporter. But then after the 1918 election, like an awful lot of people, he supported Sinn Féin, but not the IRA. And my father would never remember the IRA either. But he was a Sinn Féin supporter, and he joined the National Army, as it was called then, during the Civil War, and he was there for 3 or 4 years. I don't know how long he was in the army, and then came out, and he joined Cumann Gael, and then he did join, when Fine Gael was formed, he joined that. But he was W.T. Cosgrave's man in Cork. You know, that when W.T. came here, he was, Tony Barry was the man he looked up and who kept his eye on things from down here. But politics was much different then. Much different. There was not the branch structure then, and Fianna Fáil were very much better organised in the 30s than Fine Gael were. He didn't stand himself until the mid-50s, and he stood for the Dáil in 1954 and was elected, and he was in the Dáil and the Shannon until 1965, when he lost his seat in 1965. And then I stood for the corporation in 67, and then I stood for my first Dáil in 69.
As we heard last week, Peter Barry began his working life in the family grocery business, which had a particular reputation and interest in tea.
Fascinating trade, actually, because I was buying tea purely for the flavour and not for the appearance of the leaf. And people backed me, they thought I was right.
And during Peter Barry's early years in the business, the firm was the first in Ireland to buy tea in East Africa.
And also we bought a different make of tea called CTC.
This CTC reference reminds me of a conversation I had some 30 years ago, and in a most unlikely setting, I found myself talking at the top of a ski slope in Austria with an Englishman. When he learned I was from Ireland, he asked me if I knew Peter Barry. I said, yes, he's our foreign minister. He may be, said the Englishman, but he's an outstanding expert on CTC. That's crush, tear and curl as a method of tea production. The Englishman was in the international tea business, so next time Peter Barry was on questions and answers in the voice test before the programme went live. I asked him how come he was so highly regarded internationally as a CTC expert. He said he was very impressed by my homework. I said we had our spies everywhere. Back to politics. Satisfied with all the challenges still facing him in the tea business, how was Peter Barry persuaded to stand for politics, to stand for the Dáil?
Because Fianna Fáil had been in power for 16 years, and I thought that that was too long in a democracy. The party had been at me to stand, and I was resistant because I was interested in the business. And I said, look, I'll give it 2 shots. If I can help to change the government in 2 terms, my job is done. I'll go back to tea tasting. And we won anyway. We won the second election, and Liam Cosgrave offered me a job in the cabinet. Amazing. And you don't refuse that, so there I am, here I am.
What was your first portfolio?
Transport and power.
Was it amazing to become a government minister?
Oh yeah, of course. Of course it was. Yeah, it was an exciting time because we were a new government. We were some of the brightest and best were in that cabinet. You know, people like Conor Cruise O'Brien, Justin Keating, Gareth Fitzgerald, Richie Ryan. They were very bright people there. You know. And I was transporting power. And 3 months in my first job, the oil crisis broke, and
I remember
up to my ears in trouble. And
the queues at the petrol stations.
The queues at petrol, and people shouting at me in the street. It's all your fault.
Baptism of fire.
Exactly, yeah.
Interesting as well, because I'm interested in the North. In 1969, when you were first elected, when you saw what was happening across the border, you actually went up and sought out John Hume.
I did, yeah, because one of the motivations for going into politics from my point of view was, one, I thought Europe was important, I think. I thought that Ireland should be in there. It should be not in there with a begging bowl. It should be in there as a contributor. And the other one was that anybody living on this island could not watch what was happening in the north of Ireland and leave it there. You had to do something about it. And I didn't want to do it by violent means, as the IRA were doing. And the Unionists were absolutely 300 years out of date. And the only hope I saw was the STLP, which wasn't that at the time. And I went up. I was GD at the time. I drove up to the north and I went to Derry and I asked somebody, where does John Hume live? And I knocked on the door and I think Pat answered it.
Yeah, his lovely wife.
And I had to explain to her who I was. She never heard of me, naturally.
Who's this guy from Cork?
Anyway, Johnny that came in, I was in already, and he put it together and he called me in, you see, and we sat down. So I told him I didn't want to be listening to people making speeches about the North of Ireland. I wanted him to tell me what was going on from the inside. And I said, I come from the background, but I don't want a violent response or a violent solution. So I've been friendly with him ever since.
Yeah, and I know at the time he would say he found that very supportive. And then in 1977, of course, was when Garrett became leader.
Yes.
And many people say you stood aside then, that there was maybe a moment there in 77 when you too could have stood for the leadership and become leader.
That's right. I had no good. I couldn't have become, as I've discovered later on. But I certainly, I felt that the people who were looking for me to stand were doing it from an anti-Garrett point of view rather than a pro-Peter point of view. So I said, I thought the ordinary party members around the country wanted Garrett. So I stood aside and Garrett's elected. And he did what Enda Kenny is doing now. He surrounded himself with very competent managers. Ted Nealon now in the press office, Peter Prendergast and the director of elections and that. And he built the party from there. And I should say we built the party from there because he included everybody in the job of doing it.
And you were his deputy, of course.
Yes.
And he's written since and spoken that he really trusted you. It was one of the things, it was a word he used about you all the time, that he could really place his trust in you. Did you feel that yourself working alongside him?
Well, I think I did. I knew that he was a bit nervous about the North of Ireland, but he trusted me to do it. And I had to, some of the party were uneasy that I was getting too anti-unionist and too pro-nationalist. But I couldn't see any way to solving the problem there unless I show the nationalists that they could achieve their ends by political means and not by violent means. And that was a difficult path in the 70s now, a very difficult path to tread. And in the 80s. But we ended up with the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which I think demonstrated very clearly to the people who wanted a violent solution that was a cul-de-sac. You had to do it by democratic political means.
And that was obviously your huge success. But before that, in 1981, you were, people said, tipped to be Minister for Finance, and that you didn't take it because you felt that really Garrett wanted John Bruton to get it.
No, that's not quite true. No, I didn't take it because if you were Minister for Finance with Garrett would be the Minister for Finance and you'll be just the voice. And I wanted to be, that's
true,
not a reflection in Garrett at all. Yeah. That was just his nature. And I wanted to be in a job where I was the boss. Bit arrogant maybe, but that was the way it was.
And obviously then, because you forged the Anglo-Irish Agreement was something you brought. It was your strength, everyone says, that helped bring that about. But post Margaret Thatcher's out, that must have been an incredibly stressful time.
It was more internally in the country rather than around the world. But that's what I said earlier. If that goes wrong, you must start again and do it again. And that's precisely what we did the following morning. We sat down, we saw the clause and that any other solution will be considered. So we produced another solution and we've pursued it. And a very intelligent, dynamic and supportive civil service in Ireland and in Britain, and which are still meeting occasionally. We go to them, a lot of them dead now. They drafted, and the British side influenced Mrs. Thatcher, and the Irish side needed no influence, and we were more than willing to adopt it. So that became the Irish Agreement, which was signed in 1985, I think, yeah.
If one listens to any interview with Peter Barry about his political career, he always comes back to the North and to a lifelong interest in the challenge he believes it posed to all Irish nationalists.
You can't actually physically force 1 million unions into an Irish Republic. You can't do it by physical force. It's just impossible. And even if you could do it, you couldn't control the situation after they came. Therefore, what you had to do was make our republic down here attractive to them to come in. Now, that involved looking at their situation in the 6 counties and saying that the nationalists up there were in precisely the same position as the unionists would be in All Ireland. Therefore, the first thing you had to do was improve the lot of the nationalists and made them be treated as equal citizens, have
Not
equal
second
rights,
class, yeah.
not second class citizens, and then encourage them to take part in the running of their thing and to show them that politics can achieve more than violence. And that's what the Anglo-Irish Agreement was about. From that point of view, it was significant that the Irish government was able, they could route their grievances through the Irish government, and the Irish government, through the Anglo-Irish Conference, could take up those grievances and get them redressed. And that worked, and I think that was one of the factors that contributed to John Hume going to Gerry Adams and saying, look what you're achieving on the Anglo-Irish Agreement. Imagine if there was more cooperation, less violence, how much more you could achieve.
Yeah. So are you really satisfied with what you see now? With what has been happening over the past
yes, I
few
am,
months?
but it isn't the end product. That's not the end of it. There's a much bigger... I mean, if the Assembly in the North of Ireland doesn't fall, and if it continues to operate for some years and establishes itself, and if at that stage violence has ceased, then there's a huge job in front of Irish nationalism. Huge job. That they must show unionists that their place is here, that there is a role for them here, they have rights here, and that they must make their future here and contribute to making that future themselves in partnership with nationalists.
There was a time, and I'm not sure when exactly, but I think it could have been back in 85, when you said that peace, with capital letters, would happen, but not within 25 years. But before 50 years, which would be actually outside your own lifetime.
It would be outside my own.
Yeah,
but I mean, there's Enoch Powers has said that all political careers end in disappointment. Now, that's generally taken to interpret that people are disappointed with their own political career. But I look at it the other way around. I think every political career has to end in disappointment because there's so much you want to achieve and you've only a lifetime to do it, and a lot of what you do will only be effective after you go. And therefore, in that sense, you have to leave before the end product is visible. So in that sense, it's disappointing. But I'm not disappointed in my political life, and I don't think anybody should be.
I know in an interview with Michael Higgins of Hot Press at one stage, going back a number of years, he was asking you about the high point of your political career. And you said, I've had a lot of high points. The first time I was elected, being Lord Mayor of Cork, the ministries I've held. But when I look back, when I'm old and grey and full of sleep, the moment that will stand out in my life is when I stepped off the helicopter in Stormont Buildings to be the first Irish minister to take part in the Anglo-Irish Conference.
That would still hold, yeah.
What was so special or moving about it?
Because it was a culmination of something which I had worked hard for a number of years to persuade the British government that the government in Dublin had the right and had the duty to represent the views of nationalists of the North and to see whatever wrongs they were labouring under were corrected. And the signing of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, the establishment of the Anglo-Irish Conference, was the culmination of all that. And when I stepped off that helicopter and walked into Stormont, I thought this is a milestone.
Peter Barry, politician, from the RTE Sound Archive. Those interviews were by Carrie Crowley and Miriam O'Callaghan.